Good morning, everyone. Just for to expand a touch on the CCE that you see, the sort of cryptic initials. It's a French government think tank. So this is my hat today. I'm also dual national. I sort of put my interest on the table. I'm a Remainer, and I wake up every morning hoping this is just a bad dream. On that note, what the title of this session is, as you probably recognise, it's a quote from the Belgian Prime Minister.
Luxembourg.
Thank you, Luxembourg. Is Britain better off in the EU with opt-outs or out with opt-ins? And what we're trying to do is the history of the UK membership of the EU for the last, as long as anyone can remember, has been a member that is in, but sort of ever so slightly out, asking for opt-outs all the time. And the negotiation so far seems to aim in the same direction, in a way, by wanting to be out, but asking for lots of opt-ins. So the thought process is really trying to take out, and it's really hard, some of the passion and the extreme views out of this. Is there a way, sensible way, as I think Dr. Robin Niblett called it, a sensible Brexit? I'd call it a pragmatic Brexit, where we can find common ground, where we have a sensible relationship with the rest of the EU going forward. And that's really where I am at. I've had, like many people, the sort of same sort of shock and thought process. But as the old Irish joke goes, if you ask an Irishman where in directions for where you want to go, they normally start by saying, "I wouldn't start from here." So we don't want to start from here, but this is where we are. So, John, what is perhaps your? I'll defer to you because you've practiced the EU for a lot longer than most of us.
Well, thank you very much, Olivier. I'm not sure where to start in answering that question, but yes, it would be nice if we could find a pragmatic solution. To answer a couple of the points that Patricia has just made, I do not at the moment see any prospect for stopping Brexit, but that could change over the next 6 to 8 months. But I don't think what's happened since June 2016 has evolved in the direction of substantial changes in public opinion, and nor do I think that the debate in Parliament is likely to lead to an actual stop in the process. And I do think that at the moment, we are heading for what you might call a hard Brexit, not a soft Brexit. And like you, I'm a Remainer. I imagine almost everybody who's going to be here today is a Remainer. But we did have a referendum, and you have to accept that a large number of people voted to leave. But I think you're quite right, and the conference is quite right, to put this in the context of Britain's slightly difficult relationship with the European project from the very beginning. Britain chose to stand aside famously in both 1951 and again in 1957, and then it took Britain quite a long time to decide in the 60s that it did want to be part of this project, and all the way through its life in the project, Britain has been what you might call the back marker, squabbling about the budget first of all, unhappy with the agricultural policy, unhappy with the fisheries policy, determined not to join the single currency, and so on and so forth. And I think what Xavier Bettel put his finger on in that remark was indeed that somehow or other Britain was different from most other European countries, and it would be nice to find a pragmatic way of accommodating that. My view, for what it's worth, which I think was also shared by David Cameron, was that was precisely the position Britain was in before June 2016. It was a member of the European Union with all the benefits that gives it, but it was not part of the single currency. It was not part of the Schengen free movement of people treaty, and it was also only partly in justice and home affairs cooperation. So we had what I would call the best of both worlds. The question now for the negotiation is, can we recreate that in a different way from outside? And I'm afraid at the moment I think the negotiation is not going in a very helpful direction on either side. I mean, I think most people, it would be fair to say, would say the British are being particularly difficult because it's only very recently that Mrs May has set out precisely what she wants from her future trade relationship. And she set it out in a way that I think the European Union was bound to reject, because it was in effect to say we want to cherry pick which industries we think need to have access to the market, and we don't want others to have access to the market. And that's not how the single market, which was constructed very strongly with a very strong British push and very strong British participation, it's not how the single market is set up. So at the moment, it's a clash. It has religious overtones because there is no discussion and no sort of no common ground about the facts of the matter within this country. Sometimes there's no common ground with Brussels, which takes a rather religious view of the integrity of the single market and how we cannot. If you're not Norway, you have to be Canada in effect. But it would be good over the next 6 to 8 months to be a little bit more creative. I think creativity has been lacking so far. We are in a continent where some countries are in the euro, some countries are not in the euro. Some countries are in the European Union, some countries are not in the European Union. Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein belong to the European Economic Area. Switzerland is in a different position altogether, and there are other countries that want to join but are not ready to join, and then there is Turkey. And I think that if people could look at the continent and say we have some common interests, particularly in foreign and security policy, but also in the economic sphere, and it would be good to find some way that suited everybody of accommodating those, you could imagine a more creative outcome. But at the moment, I feel rather pessimistic about it.
Thank you. I mean, some of you may have read, there were a couple of good pieces by, and you'd expect that, Dr. Robin Niblett, the director of Chatham House, as well as Charles Grant, I think is the Centre for European Reform, the CER. And they tried to, again, go beyond the kind of, as you rightly call it, the sort of religious view, because any fact is simply dismissed and you can't reason. And they were talking, I think Charles Grant was talking about a halfway house, and Robin Niblett was talking about a sensible Brexit, whereby we would maintain the customs union and the access to the single market by and large. I sort of summarise their views, to preserve the flow of goods, which is what would be one of the more visible and more catastrophic effect of a hard Brexit on the 30th of March 2019, or perhaps 1st of January 2021, if no deal is reached. But to try and strike different deals for services where there's typically services are not part of trade agreements. So they were advocating some kind of compromise where we would stay within those two, customs union and single market. However, that the European Union is bound to say that goes with free movement of people. That's currently a red line that they are not likely to cross anytime soon, I think. And if indeed Theresa May crossed that line, it could be that she's facing a very serious challenge from some of her MPs. So, any thoughts on that?
No, I agree, and I think, I mean, one of the sad things about the referendum itself was that the original idea of David Cameron's Bloomberg speech in 2013 was that this would be a way of settling the argument about Europe once and for all. And of course, because of what happened, the argument has been even more intense since June 2016 than it was before. And I actually have always taken the view that, notwithstanding the arguments within the Conservative Party, egged on a little bit by the success of the UK Independence Party in the 2014 European elections, most British people actually took the view they didn't really like the European Union, but it wasn't a huge issue for them. They're much more concerned about things like healthcare, the education, productivity, the economy, housing, and so on. And it was only really the Conservative Party that raised the issue of Europe to the top of the agenda. And one of the worries that I have about where we are now is that Brexit is in effect all-consuming. It's taken over all of British politics. It's taken over clearly what Theresa May is trying to achieve. And when she became Prime Minister, she said she was going to try and do an awful lot for people who had not done well out of globalization, for regions of the country that had not done well. She mentioned productivity. She mentioned many things then. But actually, Brexit has become the thing that consumes this government, and I think it looks like consuming the Conservative Party. And she is very, very much boxed in, having set out those very firm red lines, which I think was a terrible mistake, She then clearly rejected the Norway option in particular, which I think was also a big mistake, because I think the Norway option could have been sold as a halfway house, with the problem about free movement of people. But she's now also a prisoner of different parts of her party, and the group of very strong Brexiteers have made clear that if she crosses too many red lines, they might call a leadership challenge. There are also a few, smaller number of soft Brexiteers in the party that have said they're also very unhappy with a hard Brexit. So the Conservative Party argument about this is going to continue right the way through, I think, to the end of 2020. I mean, in a way, the one thing that will happen this weekend is I am fairly confident there will be an agreement on the principle of a transition period. But to some extent, that is very desirable because it avoids a cliff edge Brexit on the 30th of March 2019. But it just puts the whole thing off for another year and a half, which means that the argument about Brexit will continue right the way through to December 2020 and no doubt beyond, which, for those of us who have to write about this every week, is very dispiriting.
Yes, I think I've called Brexit the black hole of society at the moment. It does swallow up everything, and in a way, I was going to say the money is the least of the issues. Yes, we do have to find budgets for all sorts of things which are spent on Brexit, which should spend on better things. But it's also the amount of mental space that is being occupied by that and pushes aside education, health, security. I mean, all the big, the north-south divide, the less south, less finance, more north, more industry. I mean, this is really a big thing. Do you think? I mean, I've looked at the sort of possible emergence of a third party pro-Europe. I think we're going to have Vince Cable come today to do a speech, and he's been vocal to say that they are the only party that is openly pro-Europe. But you look back at the early 80s when really a third party was born in this country. David Owen and three other MPs leaving the then Labour Party that was leaning to the left. Sounds familiar. And we're back 30 or 40 years later, and are we further forward? They're well-meaning, and I've got a lot of respect for the Lib Dems. If I were ever to join a political party, that probably would be it. But the fact is there any traction? I don't sense Parliament as a vehicle for changing things will be very effective. So is there an Emmanuel Macron, do you think, in British politics?
Well, that's always been the question, really, ever since the presidential election in France, because very few people, certainly very few people outside France, predicted that Macron would be able to do it. But of course, the political system is different. And although it was, and I think continues to be, a fantastic surprise that En Marche emerged out of nowhere and not only propelled Macron to the presidency, but then won a majority in the Assemblée Nationale. And yes, many people immediately said, why can't we have Emmanuel Macron here? Because it is clear from both the Brexit vote and the choice of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party that there is a gaping gap in the centre of British politics. And in a sense, I think that's what Macron was observing in France, that after having the years of Sarkozy not delivering good results, followed by the years of Hollande, for whom he worked, of course, but he didn't disguise the fact that he disagreed with much of what his president wanted to do in 2012. But he thought that there was a sort of third way. The sort of position that I think Blair took up in the 1990s, but it is much harder to do it in Britain. I think that's you just have to always accept that that's bound to be true. It'd be interesting to know what people like Chuka say when he comes to speak to this conference, because there is a group of pro-European soft Brexiteers in the Conservative Party, just as there is a group of very anti-Corbyn pro-European, wanting to stay in the single market and customs union in the Labour Party. If they could find a way of working together, you could imagine a majority. I think it's clear that there is a majority in the House of Commons. There is a majority in the House of Commons for staying in the European Union, and there certainly is a majority in the House of Commons for what you might call a soft Brexit. But the structure of British politics makes it very hard to deliver anything as a result of that majority. We will see what happens later in the year.
Welcome, Seb Dance. Just turned up the right time. We're looking for the new Macron, you see. On cue.
It's not here.
We've just been discussing the fact that the British political system makes it really hard for a third party that we know who that party is, openly pro-European, to emerge and perhaps change the dynamics of the debate at the moment.
Yes. Lamentably so. Apologies for being late. Jubilee line is the line I depend on, and this morning it let me down. So as I came in, I heard your remarks about the makeup in Parliament and your question about the direction of British politics. I think that's right. I think the political system that we have in this country means that the only way that we will get any change is via the established party structures. And that means, of course, the Labour Party, which needs to, in my view, develop its position on Europe much further than it already has. The customs union is essential, frankly, to prevent a catastrophic loss of jobs in many of the sectors, particularly in areas that Labour MPs represent, thinking, of course, primarily about manufacturing, but a whole range of jobs will be at risk without the customs union. But actually, we need much more than that. We need the single market as well. And then once you get into that territory, then you obviously begin to beg the question of what is the point of leaving the European Union, because you end up effectively following all the rules without having any say over it, which is, of course, the absurdity of Brexit in a nutshell. And I think it's overwhelmingly the case that the majority of MPs, certainly within the Labour Party, acknowledge this. And I would think I'm not sure if it's a majority, but it's a fair few in the Conservative Party feel the same way as well, which obviously leads us into this bizarre position that we are currently in, which kind of runs contrary, I think, to not just the instincts, but the information that MPs and certainly MEPs are privy to with regards to the impact that what we're doing will have on the economy and people's lives, notwithstanding, of course, the huge question mark that people have been living under for the last 18 months. And I should say, I'm sure people have said it, but as a MEP for London, let me speak on behalf of all of my colleagues, and this is cross-party as well. If you are an EU citizen, you are just as much a Londoner if you live in London as I am. You're just as much a Bristolian if you live in Bristol, or a Mancunian, or Liverpudlian, or Glaswegian, or wherever you live. You belong here, and you're welcome here, and we will do everything we can to make sure that this question mark is resolved as soon as possible. And frankly, it's a disgrace that it hasn't already. And let me apologise on behalf of the British political system that this question hasn't been resolved yet.
I'm looking at Patricia, doing for time. Have we got time for a few questions? Good. Perhaps time for anyone to...
There's one in the middle.
Yes.
You were speaking about the Emmanuel Macron. I went to a university survey presentation in September after the referendum, and they were all very pro-EU. But the chair concluded by saying he didn't think we would ever leave the EU, because the EU would be or cease to exist, one or the other. What does the panel do on that?
I think there were many people during the referendum campaign who said, don't worry about voting for Leave, because this is just the first stage in the disintegration of this terrible project. Just as many people in this country predicted when the euro was established, don't worry about it because it'll fall apart almost immediately. I just think both those views were wrong. I never thought the euro would collapse, and I certainly didn't think the European Union would fall apart because the British had voted to leave. And I think that was one of many mistakes made by the Leave campaign. I do think when I say that, I sound like an apologist for everything that is done in Brussels. I think it is always worth acknowledging the European Union is under intense strain. There's a great deal of pressure inside the system, and the euro crisis is by no means over. And differences between France and Germany will continue. There are questions about where Italy fits in now, which is particularly worrying because Italy is both too big to bail and too big to fail. So there are strong pressures inside the European Union which make the project one that needs continuing reform. But I think the popular British notion that because of that, the whole thing is about to blow up, was always misconceived and continues to be misconceived. The governments of Europe and the citizens of Europe have an immense interest at stake in preserving the European Union and indeed preserving the single currency.
No, I agree with John completely. I mean, let's suppose for a moment that the European Union disintegrated in the next 10 years. And there are scenarios under which, say, for example, a resurgent far right in the big member states, thinking, of course, primarily about France, Italy and Germany, we would go through a period of hideousness, economically, socially, culturally, all the rest of it. But I'm confident that in 50, 60 years' time, something like the European Union would be reinvented anyway because of the need for countries to work together. Now, that's the absolute worst-case scenario, but the idea of European integration isn't just about the European institutions. It isn't just Jean-Claude Juncker and the Commission and the current Parliament and all the rest of it. It is the ideal and the need for countries to be economically interdependent on each other, thereby completely removing the breakdown in relations that, of course, we've seen in Europe's history over centuries and centuries. So that will never go away. But it's not to discount the fact that there are some real problems. I mean, we've mentioned Macron earlier. A lot of my colleagues in the socialist group are particularly anti-Macron, and I can understand why. Politically, obviously, it's very difficult for my colleagues in the Parti Socialiste, but he can't fail on the bigger question of reforming Europe and European integration, because if he does, then, of course, what are they called now? They're not the Front National anymore. They've renamed themselves. So they borrowed a name from the 1930s, I understand. Rassemblement National. They will be back and ready and waiting should Macron fail. So there's a need for all pro-Europeans, whether they be on the left or the right, to ensure that he succeed on the bigger question. But that requires as much effort in France as it does in Germany, as it does in Italy, because his reforms can't succeed without the support of other European countries either. And dare I say, it includes us. It needs us as well. It needs the British pro-European left to also understand, by us I mean my lot, to get behind the European project, because there's no future long term in cutting ourselves off from the European structures. No future whatsoever, in my view.
I mean, just to link back to where we started when we talked about the uneasy relationship or certainly the different relationship that the UK has with the rest of the EU. What does strike me? We talk about the EU as if it's some kind of distant, another body, and I think it's quite characteristic of how, we talk about the continent. That's another thing that the Brits do. I wrote just a short anecdote just before the referendum. I wrote a small blog post, which obviously went entirely unnoticed, about no one had seemed to have noticed, or certainly the Remain camp, that Britain was going to have the rotating presidency of the EU come 1st of July 2017. Now, why wasn't Cameron standing on the rostrum and saying, guys, there are people who want to reform the EU, not just us, everyone. Why don't we all get together? We'll be at the wheel. We'll have a 6 months to drive the agenda and to do this. No one ever said that. And I bumped into Greg Clark. He happens to be my MP, and he was in the sort of pedestrian part of Tunbridge Wells, where I live, and he was having his surgery in the open as a tribute to Joe Cox, who had been murdered a few days before. So I went over and said, well done. I think this is a good thing to do to show your support. And I put the view to him. I said, by the way, do you realize that we're going to have the rotating, or we're going to have at that time before the vote? And he kind of thought for a minute and said, oh, that's a good idea. And you could see how detached he was from the sort of the whole idea of, being engaged, this European concept. It was a very transactional view, and I think even plenty of Remainers have that very transactional view with the concept of Europe. The only good thing about this referendum is that this is the first time I've been here 30 years that I see actually people debate with some passion about this. This is the only good thing about it.
I mean, I agree, because one of the problems that I came across all the time during the campaign was this contention by the pro-Brexit side that Britain had no influence at all over the European Union. But at the same time, they would say, when we leave the European Union, we'll have immense global influence because we're a very strong power and so on. And the two statements were incompatible. And anybody who spent time in Brussels and understood how the system worked knew very well that Britain was one of the most important countries in the European Union, had a very strong influence, had been very influential in the development of the single market, competition policy, and so on in Brussels. And I think one of the problems about the whole approach to the referendum was that successive governments, not just Conservative governments, had spent many years denigrating Brussels and saying the European Union is the source of all our problems, and never praising the European Union for anything.
But if I could say, this is a common problem across the EU. I see my colleagues doing this in other countries. They say, oh, everything that goes right is the success of the national and regional politicians. Everything that goes wrong is Brussels' fault. And I tell them all the time, the logical conclusion in what you're doing is what is the mess that we've ended up here in this country. And it could happen in other countries as well if they carry on down this path. But I think they're learning their lesson fairly sharpish.
Yes. Have we got time for one more question? Yes.
I wonder if you can comment on the news of the weekend of Facebook, Cambridge Analytica. Hi. I wonder if you can comment on the news over the weekend on Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, and the tampering allegedly by Russians on the election, because there's a very specific declaration by Chris Willey, the top scientist for Cambridge Analytica, that they beta tested the effects of the Trump campaign on Brexit. So we were the guinea pig for the elections in the US, and that would mean a huge manipulation of the electorate. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, I'll get the tough one.
I didn't know the answer.
I mean, I like many, I suspect, in this room, I have my suspicions on the level to which information was manipulated. There's all sorts of anecdotal stories from the campaign, door-knocking sessions in areas that ended up voting heavily for Leave, where people would answer the door and quote statistics that were completely bizarre but consistent when knocking on doors. The level of information that was able to be disseminated, right down to information on your local street, on how many people had moved into your local street from other countries and they were using the NHS and blah, blah, blah. This information was obviously coming from somewhere. And so I have my suspicions, and I think it was very interesting and intriguing this weekend, this story, which I suspect will develop further as more and more information comes out. The idea of manipulating an electorate and feeding them false information, of course, is nothing new. It happens every day in the tabloid press. And you could make a very clear argument for the kind of misleading information that is put on the front pages of some leading tabloids day in, day out as being an example of this. But when it reaches inside people's homes, when it's personalised through the online activity that they do and tailored to their personal tastes and so on, it does bring us to a new level. The questions of whether or not that undermines the result, of course, is a political question. I think it certainly, when you look at the geopolitical situation that we're in, I think we should be questioning very carefully the timing of what we're doing. There was a very good quote this morning on the radio. I've forgotten the source. It's going to come to me in about 2 minutes, so I might interject and put the name out. But he said that Russia was testing the UK. It's akin to a lion sort of looking at a herd of deer, and there's one deer that is lagging behind, perhaps because that deer has happened to leave the EU, and this lion is now testing the strength and the resolve of the pack to look after this deer. And I think it's a very good analogy. I think when we are faced with so many dangers and an uncertain and very changing world, we have to question what is to be gained from leaving the European Union. I think this is another step in that question. But ultimately, it's a political question, and whether any laws have been broken, I don't know. But the nature of these things, of course, is as you get more and more information, it becomes clearer and clearer. But it's certainly a development worth watching.
I agree.
Yes, I mean, I would agree with that, and I would say it's absolutely right that we look into this in a lot of detail, because it's incredibly serious. Can you use that to overturn the result? No, you can't. I'm afraid I think that's some people asking themselves the question: can we possibly, go back to the ballot by saying this was a skewed result because of that? No, I don't think so.
No, I think that's the problem.
Yeah. One more question?
Well, I don't know. Yeah. I just wanted to ask you if you think that the local elections on the 3rd of May will have an impact. I know the turnout is fairly low, 25% in London, but I was just wondering if it's likely to have an impact on government policy, or in view of the difference between local and general elections. What are your thoughts on the local elections on the 3rd of May?
I mean, you probably know more about that than I do. I mean, certainly it seems clear that the Conservatives are going to do incredibly badly in London. And London is, I think, 40% of the seats that are up in May are in London. And I think that the Conservatives will ponder that. The fact that they lost places like Kensington and Canterbury in the last election also tells you something. But I'm afraid I don't myself think it will promptly lead to a change of policy, because I think the Conservatives may well make gains in the north of the country. And they've sort of got to a position where I think a lot of them have written off London already. London is now regarded as Labour's heartland to some extent.
Yes. By the way, Ian McEwan was this morning on the radio. The June 2017 election had an incredible impact on the direction of travel. If you remember, May went to the country to get the backing for the hard, full Brexit on steroids that the right of her party were demanding for so long and are still demanding. And she lost that mandate quite substantially. There were two things that happened in that June 2017 election. Firstly, the Labour Party picked up a lot of support as a reaction to, if you like, the, dare I say, somewhat nativist approach that the Prime Minister was taking, and yes, the lacklustre campaign as well. And they saw Labour as offering a viable alternative. But the other thing that happened in that election was the Tory Remain vote stayed at home. And I think that the domestic arena is where we will influence the direction of travel. I see a lot of companies go over to Brussels and say to my colleagues over there, you'll suffer from Brexit as well. And they say, well, we know that, but your government's red lines are X, Y, Z, that constrains us. It's here where the change will happen. It's in the domestic political arena where this change has happened. Brussels sees this rightly as the UK's decision, and it can stay, it can leave, but it's up to the UK. But the red lines that the UK put forward constrains what Brussels' reaction is. And I think these local elections will be a chance to influence yet again the course of direction. And that's why it's very, very important that we remind people that actually you can send a very, very strong signal to the government through these elections. And this is, of course, currently, as things stand, the last election where EU27 citizens will be able to vote. And I strongly urge everybody to use that vote and to use it wisely and carefully. Take, for example, the impact of the Tories losing a council like Wandsworth would be enormous, absolutely enormous. It would send a huge, huge signal that the Tories' core support in big cities is failing and deserting them. And actually, yes, okay, the Tories may have written off London for the time being, but actually it's other metropolitan areas where they're not electing the same number of seats, because London elects all of the seats in one go, whereas everywhere else it's a third of the council. It will nonetheless send a huge signal to the party that they are shrinking their voter base quite substantially at a time when the other parties are expanding their voter base, and that should galvanise the pro-European Conservatives, because ultimately that's what we need. We need the 20 or 30 Tory MPs who are prepared to stand up for the country over their party to have something to embolden them, and these local elections could do just that.